Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much. I want to just echo the thanks to Dean Small and Department Chair Edwards for coming. It's nice to meet you. Nice to be here on your campus. And I want to thank Professor Salvino and Professor Hale for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be back. I drove in from Asheville this morning. I teach at Western Carolina University, which is about 45 minutes west of Asheville. And it was an easy drive, as I mentioned earlier, because it's mostly downhill from Asheville to here. So just checking up the awake test there. Now, just to sort of set the stage a little bit, looking at the world through a particular lens that you're trained in, whether that's public relations or engineering, whether that's the principles of politics and or history, what you want to do is you want to recognize that lens can give you a perspective on things, but that you'd always want to look for ways to sort of challenge that perspective, complement it with others, and come to a real understanding, of what's happening. I think that's especially important for young people today. The rest of your promising and bright lives are fundamentally informed by the last 18 months. And so, come into a real good understanding of what's happening in your life, in our lives at this time. Before I get going, I just want to mention that through the Center for the Study of Free Enterprise at Western Carolina, I have the chance to work with faculty members and their students from all different disciplines. And one of them, for example, taught me a lot coming from the social work perspective, that this pandemic has been what she describes as a mass trauma event. In other words, it's affecting all of us. And it's affecting all of us in a way that social workers and psychologists, like my wife, understand to be traumatic. But what was really interesting about my colleague in social work that broadened my perspective was the way that her work with her graduate student characterizes the pandemic as an opportunity. Not an opportunity that we would welcome, that we would dive into, that we would say, let's do that again. But an opportunity that since it's here, since it has affected us all as a mass trauma event, there is some way to grow from it. And not to go through each and every one of the details, but the theme was post-traumatic growth. And the study that she wrote for my center was focused on what are the practical steps, what are the skills that need to be developed in order to grow from the pandemic, to grow from the trauma of it. The reason I think I learned from that is because it's such a parallel to the way economists look at a mass shock. Because whenever we're, as economists, looking at the situation of life, our long-term perspective is always grounded on the concept of economic growth. And so here's my colleague from social work, giving a perspective about post-traumatic growth. And meanwhile, I'm working on my studies about post-pandemic economic growth. And that's just one example of the way that I think that I've sort of lived this lesson of broadening and deepening my own understanding based on taking in the perspectives of other people, looking through the lenses that they have. So I'm going to give you a perspective that comes from economics on what's going on out there. Now, recognizing that I'm biased because I am an economist, I think that this is a super important perspective for everyone to sort of begin, but to really appreciate. And, recognize that there's things that you might disagree with. There's things that you might say, oh, I'm going to look at it a different way. But I think that the theme of this talk will be much of what has happened in the pandemic and much of the decisions that have been made by leaders in the pandemic, not just political leaders, but business leaders and organizational leaders and community leaders. They have kind of sailed past a lot of basic economic principles that matter to our lives. And in some cases, they've not just sailed past them, but like actively jettisoned them. We don't want this, get it out of here. And so this talk, there's nothing complicated here. There's some concepts that I'm going to try to gain a little traction from, but they're basic concepts. And so, my favor to ask of you is to think about how could you, put these into your own combination of perspectives and your understanding. So, to sort of take a look at the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on four. Think of these as stories, if you will. 4 stories of things that are happening in the pandemic, and 4 economic concepts that can help us to understand those stories. So on the left, you have a list of words that is going to appear in every single economics textbook at the principles level. And on the right, we have some words that are sort of familiar to us in our common experience. Cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. These are the statistics of the virus itself and how it is affecting human beings. But unbeknownst to the world out there that's passing by these economic concepts, there's a very important way of understanding what is the measurable empirical relationship between cases and hospitalizations on one hand, and between cases and deaths on the other hand. That's going to be our first story. The second story is the signs that we have all seen as patrons of business establishments that say, sorry, we're not doing so-and-so anymore because we're short-staffed. And there's a concept called the shutdown rule that I'm going to make an argument for better, that the shutdown rule can help us to better understand what's going on out there. How are our leaders managing pandemic risk? Again, not just our political leaders, but our business leaders and our community leaders as well. And the concept there is moral hazard. It's a funny word. I'll explain it if you haven't already put it into your quiver of knowledge. But then, the most fundamental concept I think that's being sailed past is the invisible hand, which comes to us from a long ago, but still very important thinker by the name of Adam Smith, whose book in 1776, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, proposes that economies work something like an invisible hand, and I'll elaborate on that. So first of all, why is it important to understand the empirical relationship between cases and hospitalizations, between cases and deaths? Well, you might say that's the answer to that is obvious, but let's peel it apart a little bit. One reason we might look at that as an obvious thing is because our leaders, especially our political leaders and our public health leaders, are very regularly, very frequently, anchoring their decisions and their outlooks to the number of new cases, and specifically on a daily basis. If you go back to April of 2020, what we really have here is we have a concentration of new cases in the Northeast. And what happened, people's attention is drawn to what's happening in the Northeast. Resources are flowing into the Northeast. California is sending ventilators to New York. The extent to which we're worried, or what you might call the fear factor, is also focusing on the Northeast in April of 2020. Why is that? That's because that's where the cases are happening. And it's also because we see a pretty strong correspondence between cases that are happening and then subsequent hospitalizations. Cases that are happening and subsequent deaths, COVID deaths. And, it might take a little bit of dusting off the memory, but remember the flatten the curve, that was all about the priority not to over demand the hospitals and not to the capacity of hospitals with COVID cases. That was the priority. And so, of course, it's important to understand this magnitude. Let me just give you a counterfactual for a moment. Suppose that new cases initially led to hospitalizations at a one-to-one correspondence. Everyone who got COVID ended up in the hospital. That's one way to look at the situation. But suppose that instead there are new cases. For every new case, not every one of those ends up in the hospital, but some fraction of them, and maybe it's even a small fraction. If you think about it this way, then you're not too far away from asking, well, wait a minute, what if that fraction was really high in April in the Northeast, say in New York? You have a high number of cases leading to hospitalizations and a high number of cases leading to deaths. But what if then, in the July surge, which focused on southern states and a little bit in the West, what if that proportion was lower? What if somehow, due to some things that maybe we can put our finger on, but from a combination of factors, what if cases are leading to hospitalizations at a lower rate after that April surge? And then, coming forward into the fall 2020 surge, what if that proportion, what if this relationship between cases and deaths changes even more? That would be important to put our finger on. That would be important to the political leaders and the public health officials who are pegging their decisions to what's happening with daily cases. Well, as a matter of fact, the concept of elasticity in economics can help with exactly that empirical question. How is the relationship between cases and hospitalizations, between cases and deaths, changing as we move forward in time from April 2020 and as we move farther away in geography from the Northeast? Of course, there's lots of factors that will determine that. The weather, people's behavior, treatments, the effectiveness of non-pharmaceutical interventions such as lockdowns and so forth. Lots of things can come into play. We can understand that those things are there, but while saying, let's first just look at the relationship. And so two of my colleagues and I, Steve Miller at Troy University and Craig Richardson at Winston-Salem State University, are doing a study that have written a study that does exactly this. And what we're able to find is that the relationship between cases and deaths in the Northeast was very strong. The elasticity number, the math on the screen here, washed out to about a number of 0.8. And what that means is if cases were to rise by 10% on any given day or any given, they measured on a 7-day window, we could expect deaths to rise by 8% approximately 2 to 3 weeks later. That 0.8 is a big number. However, our study is indicating that when you look at farther in time from April 2020, and if you look at farther in distance from the Northeast, that number is falling to where the overall number, looking at the April 2020 and forward, even through the Delta variant surge, is about 0.4. So that's a very, very different number. 10% rise in cases leads to 4% rise in deaths. That's a very, very different number compared to 10% cases leads to 8% rise in deaths. And we find similar effects on hospitalizations. Well, that's a more complicated figure once we enter the Delta variant phase. So I'll focus on the deaths number. How would this matter to our understanding? One thing it would do is maybe we should focus less on cases per se and more on how do cases lead to hospitalizations and deaths. Because in the media and in opinion pieces and in press news conferences by public health officials, if you listen carefully, there's a presumed elasticity underlying what they're saying. They're saying, you guys need to just work together a little while longer, keep your behavior, your 3 W's. During a shelter-in-place period, it would be just, hang on a little longer. We got to get this infection rate down, because cases are going to lead to more hospitalizations and cases are going to lead to more deaths. Now, you don't have to point fingers at these folks and say there's something wrong with your position. What you can say is like, hey, could you take an evidence-based approach? And the evidence suggests that the priority, the public health priority, and the policy, the political leaders' priority on new cases leading to bad outcomes for society, that priority is shrinking over time. And it could be just in general that we're getting better at the pandemic. I think that lesson has yet to sort of bubble up in the public discourse. And maybe that's an idea that you can pack away for your understanding coming from the economics perspective. Now, elasticity is all about math, but it's also about, hey, testing products, right? This is a clip, an image from an old TV commercial where the Hanes brand underwear, they advertise the quality of it by saying Inspector number 12 is going to make sure that the elastic is good, okay? And what we want to do is we want to make sure that the elasticity, that as we understand it, between cases and hospitalizations, between cases and deaths, is tested, and that it's good. We want to be, each of us, little Inspector number 12s out there. And the concept of elasticity can help us to do that. So the next point that the next of the 4 stories would be, sorry, we're short-staffed, something that that everyone who's been out in the retail space has been familiar with. Grocery stores, restaurants, gyms, hardware stores, you name it. Anywhere there's an establishment with a customer-facing real space has encountered some form of this. But the question is, why do we see this more frequently and with more severity in certain types of establishments and in certain situations compared to others? If we want to understand what's happening here, I think that economics can help. And there's 2 points that I'd like to make. The first point is, this is just an illustration of the problem. I'm going to come back to this if that's all right. But the first point I want to make is, sorry, more math. This is a graphical model of a business firm. Maybe it's one of these establishments that you've walked into. And this model says there's kind of a break-even point where it makes sense for this establishment to no longer stay open for the rest of the day. It's called the shutdown rule. It's a short-term concept. It's driven by the logic that firms want to earn profits. Now, the story that we hear about, sorry, we'll be closing at 7 p.m. This is a picture that I took outside my favorite fried chicken place, Popeyes in Nashville. I usually get a 4-piece for my Saturday college football. And my son usually comes and grabs one of the pieces, all right? But that's a thing. That's a thing these days, isn't it? And many of your big retail chains, such as Starbucks, are cutting back on their hours. On the right, this is a picture I took at a Fairfield Inn that I stayed at last week in Shelby, North Carolina. And it says, basically, hey, we have changed the default. The default used to be, we're going to come into your room and give you housekeeping service every day. Now the new default is, we're not going to do anything unless you ask us, and unless you ask us 24 hours in advance. This is the type of thing that's permeating our experience in the economy, especially in the customer-facing parts of our economy. Now, what's the story that we get here? The story that we get here is some combination of, when governments extended unemployment insurance benefits, both in the duration, how long a person can receive benefits, but also in the amount, how much of the person's earnings get replaced by the unemployment insurance benefits. Both of those were increased during the pandemic. And this reduces down to the trope that you may have heard. We're paying people more to sit on the couch than we are to for them to go to work. That's got to be part of the story. But if you say that the story ends there, I think that you might benefit from opening up to a little bit more of the economic perspective, because I think there is more going on here. First of all, the food service industry is facing labor supply and labor demand problems in all developed countries. And we didn't have this unemployment insurance extension in all those developed countries. So something else has to be in play just to be recognize that point. The logic of this model is, the other point that we want to recognize is the firm's perspective on seeking profits. So one of my brothers is in logistics. He has run a trucking company. He has run some warehouses. He has run some restaurants. And now he runs a factory that makes Chromebooks. And I asked my brother, I said, tell me about your restaurant. And through the conversation, a story, something like this comes out. Well, our posted hours are until 11. And sometimes it might be, some evenings, maybe it's a Tuesday, around 8 o'clock, it just becomes pretty clear that we're not going to have a whole lot more customers, that our revenue isn't going to be, very high. But we're going to stay open because we posted our hours till 11. Now, one of the scenarios that's happening there is, it could be, I'm going to come up here for a sec, it could be that the restaurant is operating in this range of the model, where they're going to be making a loss. But the key to the shutdown rule is, at least they're covering their variable costs. All right? Now, the idea there is, suppose that my brother could send all the workers home at 8:30. We're not going to make any more money tonight. We're sending you home. The model says, do that if the revenue that you're going to get doesn't meet your variable costs. The idea there is, he still has to pay the light bill, even if he closes for the evening. He's still got to pay the fixed costs. But if you stay open and you don't get any revenue, now you also have to pay your labor costs. And so the lesser of those two negative profits is, go ahead and shut down for the evening. But why, Marco? I say, why don't you shut down? And he says, because corporate goodwill. And I say, tell me about corporate goodwill here. And he says, well, suppose that suppose I send everybody home at 8:30, and then a couple comes up at 9 o'clock, and they're on a date or something, and they found us on Yelp because the place is open till 11. And they walk up and they find out that the place is closed. And there's not really any good reason other than the firm is a greedy profit maximizer. Well, what's going to happen next? They're going to get frustrated, and they're going to go on to Yelp, and they're going to say, this firm is a greedy profit maximizer. They closed at 8:30. I showed up at 9. What, am I not good enough for them? The goodwill is on the line, and that's why some companies won't even shut down, even if they're below their average variable costs. In other words, you eat those short-run losses in order to maintain your long-run reputation. Now tell that whole story again during the pandemic. Let's tell that whole story again, not in the old normal, but with our new normal. That story gets told with a sign like this. And a sign like this does not have the goodwill component to it. The couple walks up to the restaurant, sees that it's closed, and doesn't blame the greedy profit maximizing establishment. They blame the situation. And they might say, I don't even want to go on Yelp and give this bad review because I might look bad in doing it. So the pandemic has wiped away any reason for firms not to exercise the shutdown rule. And this is something that not only gives us an additional way of understanding the closures and the decrease of options that firms are offering. But it also gives us a way to answer the question that I led with, which is why do we see this more in some places and not so much in other places? So if you're a fast food place that is very, very capital intensive, like how many of you have gone into a fast food place and ordered your meal on the kiosk, right? That's an example of a place that's capital intensive. Now, when you're capital intensive, something called the marginal product of labor is very high. And what that means is you can afford to pay a high wage because each of your workers is relatively productive, working with all that capital. Now imagine, it's a mom and pop circumstance, and they don't have a kiosk in there. They don't have the 50 grand to invest in that capital. They take their orders on a piece of paper, and Pop is in the back at the skillet making the burgers. Well, in that establishment, which is a low capital situation, the marginal product of labor is also low. Now compare these two now to what's going on in order to attract labor. We have a labor force participation rate across the economy that went off a cliff and has recovered, but is still about 10% lower than it was before the pandemic. We have a lot of people who have just, the phrase that was mentioned earlier, the great resignation. A lot of people who are saying, it's not worth it for me to be hustling right now. And that poses a real problem for those labor-intensive establishments. The mom and pop are driving, from their house to their restaurant, and along the way they see the kiosks at Burger King and McDonald's and other places saying, $18 an hour, $500 retention bonus. And they're saying, I can't compete with that. And this model says that the mom and pop cost curves rise because of the pandemic. And their shutdown point, they have to have even more revenue not to shut down. Whereas the other establishments that are more capital intensive might be able to. All right, so we've learned a little bit about how the economic perspective can help us understand not only what's going on with short staffing, it's more than the extension of unemployment insurance benefits, but also how it might affect some places more than others. Where that labor is where in establishments where labor is highly productive, they can afford to pay the wage premiums that we're seeing these days, but other places cannot. What about the third story, social risk? So where I live, a community that does a turkey trot every year canceled their turkey trot in 2020. Makes sense, right? Everybody did that. But I saw on the news yesterday morning that they canceled it also for 2021. And I was a little dismayed by that. I have to tell you honestly, I was really disappointed to hear that. I mean, not that I go out on Thanksgiving morning and run. I get ready to eat. But at the same time, it's just one of those things, and you might have a similar type of, you might recollect a similar type of sentiment and reaction to something not going. So why is it that they would cancel in 2021? It's because the organization that runs the turkey trot has absorbed a great portion of the risk and says if anything happens, if maybe even if a single case is transmitted on the watch of us running a turkey trot, then it's all of our rear ends, the organizers. There's a concept in economics called moral hazard. And moral hazard says basically, if a person is in some way or another insulated from the downside consequences of risk-taking behavior, then that person will engage in a little bit more risky behavior. There are some classic examples. There might be some folks in the room who like, classic 70s muscle cars, right? And you might not own one yet, but you got your eye on one, all right? Well, think about what cars were like in the 70s. They were big, they were heavy, and they were lethal. They were literally lethal because they didn't have much in the way of protections. Now, protections come along in the 70s, including 3-point seat belts, as opposed to just the lap belt. padded dashboards and steering wheels. A surprising number of people just died by hitting their head on the steel steering wheel. And crumple zones and so forth in the car. Cars became safer. And a safety engineer shouted, hurrah, because this means that fewer people are going to die in car crashes. But economists were back here saying, hey, we're kind of missing a little bit of the puzzle here, and it's called moral hazard. And the idea of moral hazard is when you make cars safer, people are going to drive less safely. When you make cars safer, people are going to drive less safely. Now, it's not that people become maniacs and look for that tree to barrel into, right? It's that people take drivers tend to take more small risks. So you drop that thing in the passenger seat and it accidentally goes down onto the floorboard, and maybe people are reaching over there more for it with safe cars compared to not safe cars, right? Oh, it's got an airbag, I'll be all right. Now, when economists go and study this, it turns out that there was about a proportionate increase of the safety as there was an increase in unsafe driving. So the long and the short of it is, seatbelts didn't really save lives. And the reason why is because of the moral hazard reaction that human beings have, that each of us, you and I, have. When we're insulated from the downside consequences of our risk-taking behavior, we tend to take a little bit more risk. And there's some other examples here on the screen. I'll be happy to talk about with you some more. But I want to talk about what is the opposite of moral hazard? What would be not removing the risk, the downside consequences of risky behavior from a person, but instead piling on risk to one person for everybody's behavior? Well, it would be the opposite of moral hazard, wouldn't it? It would be immoral hazard. And, in a way, this is what happened to the turkey trot. The organizers of the turkey trot were in a position where the risk of everyone's behavior in the event meant, their rear end. Okay, now think about the CDC here for a moment. Think about the President of the United States here for a moment. Regardless of the decisions of either of those bodies, when bad things happen on their watch, they get blamed. So what does that mean? What that means is our leaders, political leaders, community leaders, they have the incentive to go to great lengths to reduce risky behavior. And they might have the incentive to go to such great lengths that it's irrational and it's not really defensible on logical grounds. Now, the science is mixed, but everyone in here is required to be wearing a mask. And the science is mixed, but if you want to go to, if you want to go inside a bar in many places, certainly in Asheville, you have to show proof of vaccination. If you want to go to the Southern Economic Association meetings in Houston next month, you have to show proof of vaccination. If you want to go to the Buffalo Bills football game in Erie County, New York, you have to show proof of vaccination. Now, I say the science is mixed, but I would say that the rational defense of those steps depends on the efficacy of being vaccinated in reducing transmission rates. But we know about this thing called a breakthrough case, right? You're looking at one. I was double vaccinated with the Pfizer in March. I got COVID in July. I probably passed it to some people as well because in early July, we weren't yet aware that the Delta variant was taking off. Harvard MBA program went to virtual this year. Why? Because there was a high transmission rate, even though all of the Harvard MBA students had been vaccinated. So we have a world that in many ways is hard for us to make sense of, because a lot of it doesn't make sense unless you think about the fact that when a person, such as the President of the United States, or when a group of people, such as the board of the Centers for Disease Control, when they are in a position such that they own the risk for other people's behavior, they're going to exercise this thing that I've dubbed the immoral hazard, which is really just straight out of an economics textbook. Just turn it upside down. Lastly, the everything shortage. The Atlantic ran a story 2 weeks ago, I believe. America is running out of everything. Now, maybe that's an exaggeration. It probably is. But we all are also thinking about our own experiences and not being able to get our hands on goods and services that we used to be able to without any problem. I took a photo. I couldn't find it for the did I find it? No, I didn't. I went and I tried to find some soccer cleats for my 13-year-old. And we went to 5 stores. And there's not a lot of stores in Asheville. So we were almost running out of stores to go to. And finally, at Dick's Sporting Goods, I found a good pair. But in the Nike store at the outlets in Asheville, I did take a picture of it. One of the aisles, probably about 80% of the shelf space was empty. So what's the problem here? The problem is this Atlantic piece puts part of the problem into focus, and says, well, the ports are closed, and we've heard about that. Well, there aren't enough truck drivers, and we've heard about that. And the ports are closing partly because of the virus itself. Workers in the ports are getting sick. But the ports are also closing, because of immoral hazard. So it's a complicated confluence of these arguments. But let me try to simplify it. Remember what it was like in the before times? I've been teaching economics for about 25 years. And one of the things I often ask my students is, tell me about the time when you went into the grocery store and you didn't find what you were looking for. That's kind of a hard question, isn't it? You have to think, well, yeah, but I was looking for something weird. That's typically the answers that I get where you go to the grocery store and you can't find what you're looking for. It's typically because, well, that's not the kind of thing that grocery stores tend to carry a lot. It was so orderly. It was so orderly. And this is a picture that I dug out from 1989. The Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, which is kind of weird to refer to this as old normal when you're using Boris Yeltsin as an example. But you might need to know a little bit about his persona to get that attempt at a joke. The Russian president, and this is prior to Perestroika and Glasnost, prior to those two initiatives freeing up and opening up the Russian economy, the Soviet economy, comes to the United States and tours a regular old grocery store and is marveling at what? Marveling at the variety of goods that are available, marveling at the depth to which the shelves are stacked, the inventory, marveling at the price points. Our old normal was marvelous, folks, and it was so orderly. And I think that when I used to try to teach my students about this point, I was at a little bit of a disadvantage compared to where I am now, because each of us has the experience of the old normal and how orderly it was compared to the new normal and how just disorderly it has become. And this is the point that I tried to make when I wrote a piece recently. Actually, it was in late December, early January, if I remember right, called I Vaccine. What a marvelous achievement that vaccines were made available less than a year into, depending on how you mark the starting point, into the pandemic. In fact, the chemistry was worked out within a few days, but the scaling up and the industrialization and the production of it took until, and the approval of it, the testing and the approval of it took until December. Well, once the vaccines were available, do you remember the footage of the trucks packed with vaccines leaving the Pfizer facilities in Michigan? And I remember a lot of commentators saying, don't worry, we're going to get that vaccine out to every single person in America. We're going to use the military to do it. And I said, the military? The military doesn't have a core competency in distribution of goods and services across the economy. Where does that core competency lie? It lies in the invisible hand. It rests in the distributed decisions of individual buyers and sellers in the marketplace. And so the idea of iVaccine is based on a story written in 1950 called iPencil. And the author of that story, iPencil, his name is Leonard Reed, he told the story from the perspective of the ordinary pencil, the one that you and I might take for granted. He says, you might take me for granted. You might not even know how much you paid for me, but me, little old ordinary pencil, I'm a wonder of human achievement. And I urge you to go find that essay, or I urge you to go watch that 6-minute YouTube video, iPencil. Because what it does is it tells us, what do supply chains look like, first of all, and it also tells us that there's so many untold numbers of people whose efforts on a daily basis are critical to you and I being able to pick up an ordinary pencil and take it for granted. And what's even more astounding in this invisible hand story is that none of those untold numbers of people cares about you and me having a pencil. What they care about is going, taking care of their family and going to work so that they can come home and feed and pay their bills and have some entertainment. It's the invisible hand at work that distributed the vaccine. It was Operation Warp Speed for 3 of the vaccine producers, and Pfizer's own skin in the game for the Pfizer vaccine that led to the production of it. But when we're talking about distribution, we can add to our understanding of what's going on by bringing into our perspective the idea of the invisible hand. So that's my 4 stories. I think what I'd like to do is just sort of use that as the tee up of some conversation. And if I'm correct, we'll have Rob and Sourav coming up to join me here. Thank you.